Welcome to week 3 of the 2021 federal election and the ongoing Earnscliffe webinar series. I'm excited today to be joined by colleagues from Western Canada, and that lest any of you think that I'm an effete Central Canadian snob, I want to remind everyone that I too am a son of the Canadian prairies. So I'm joined by Nikki Hill. Nikki is in our Vancouver office, NDP senior advisor for well over a decade, director of BC operations in Jack Layton's 3 campaigns during the mid 2000s. Carling Dick, also from our Vancouver office, a former advisor, worked with both Gordon Campbell, Premier Gordon Campbell, and Christy Clark in BC. Jamie Miley runs our Saskatchewan operation, former senior advisor to 2 federal cabinet ministers, most recently senior advisor to the Minister of Finance, and the notorious Bruce Young, a lifelong Liberal. He was the BC policy advisor to Prime Minister Paul Martin and the co-chair of the campaign in 2005 that introduced Justin Trudeau as the Prime Minister of Canada. I want to remind everyone who's tuned in, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You should feel free to ask questions to either individual panelists or the panel as a group. Carling is going to be monitoring those. We will stop our conversation a couple times over the course of the next hour and get to those. Those that we don't get to, we'll answer in writing before. Those of you who know Earnscliffe know that it's a multidisciplinary public affairs consultants and strategy company. We have experts in government relations, strategic communications, and public opinion research. As we have in our last webinars, we want to set the table with some research. Our public opinion unit has been both aggregating all the public available polls as well as doing custom research that we get out of the field on Sunday, I believe. I'm joined by Hilary Martin, one of our senior consultants, and she's going to walk you through both some of the aggregated findings and also some of the custom work we've done over the last week. Hilary, over to you.
Hi, Allan. Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here today to share some of our findings with you. I'll begin by sharing my screen. Go back to the beginning and walk you through a few of our slides that we have today. So to begin, this is just our methodology for this week, sample size, field dates. And if you have any questions about how we conduct this research, all that information can be found on our website. The link is at the bottom here. And I've also just briefly included the slide for last week because we will be talking about some of last week's data later on. So, the moment everyone's been waiting for. Last week, we mentioned that it would be telling if the slight changes that we had observed in vote intention signaled a broader change in direction of party support in the coming weeks. And that seems to have been borne out based on the numbers that we collected over the weekend. So we have the Conservatives continuing to gain, up from 30% in our poll last week to 34% this week. The Liberals sliding 3 points to 30%, and the NDP gaining 3 points to 24% overall nationally. We've also seen some interesting movement and tightening of the races in a few key regions across the country. Beginning with Ontario, the Liberals and the Conservatives are tied, statistically speaking, at 35% and 34% respectively. And the NDP, of note, is at 25%, which is a strong showing for them in Ontario. In Quebec, where the Liberals have previously led the fairly commanding lead at the outset of the election, we have them now at 29%, statistically tied with the Bloc at 28%. And the Conservatives and the NDP have also made some gains in Quebec as well, the Conservatives at 21 and the NDP at 17. Finally, the last region I'll speak to just quickly is BC. We currently have the NDP leading, followed by the Liberals and then the Conservatives. But as I'll get to on our regional aggregate slide, there's a lot going on in BC, and I think my colleagues will speak to some of those dynamics a bit later on. Next, I will just very briefly show you our tracking for the overall national vote based on the publicly available polls from April to today. And we see the trend line for the Conservatives going up, for the Liberals going down, and the NDP continuing this sort of slow, steady increase that we've observed since the spring. As always, we keep an eye on the regions. As I mentioned, BC still looking a little bit messy in terms of the publicly available data that's out there. Some polls, including ours, showing the NDP ahead, whereas others might be a bit more variable. In Ontario, you see, based on the trend line here, what we were referencing as it relates to our own data, that the gap between the Conservatives and the Liberals in most polls seems to have closed. And the NDP as well, some steady gains, particularly over the last week or so in the province. And then finally in Quebec, the Liberals, as I had mentioned at the outset of the campaign, in a strong position. Now they've lost some of that support and are running much closer to the Bloc, whose vote share has remained somewhat stable. And you can see just down in the bottom right of the screen there that the Conservatives and the NDP have also made some gains that have been reflected in several polls that have come out in the past few weeks.
Just 2 points on that, Hillary, that relate to what we showed in the past. I mean, we noted last week that the tightening in Ontario was largely a function of the Conservatives picking up in the suburbs. They literally picked up 11 points in the suburbs between week 1 and 2. Also, the very first week, we talked about the surprising election of the Progressive Conservatives in Nova Scotia, and whether this was an aberration or it portended something larger. And that, well, Hillary noted our sample is small in Atlantic Canada. We've seen some really big changes there. There's 33 seats, and the Liberals have dominated tremendously there in the past. And in our own polling now, it looks very, very competitive.
It does look competitive, Allan. And while the sample size in our own poll is small, the beauty of aggregating and presenting all of these publicly released polls together is that you can see the trends from many polls. Right. And you see that trend line in Atlantic Canada for the Liberals trending down and for the Conservatives up. So it's becoming more competitive in that region too, for sure. So one of the custom questions that we asked this week was about party momentum. Which parties are gaining momentum, which are losing momentum? Have they not really changed in terms of momentum? Or have you as the respondent just not been paying close enough attention to offer a view on this question? And right here on this slide, I've presented the proportions who say that each party is gaining momentum versus losing momentum. And what we see clearly is that more feel the Conservatives and the NDP are gaining than losing momentum. 45% feel the Conservative campaign is gaining momentum, 41% the NDP. And that stands in stark contrast to the results for the Liberals. Over half, 56%, feel that the campaign is losing momentum, and just 11% would say that it's gaining momentum. And here, just as another insightful little tidbit, we've broken down the momentum scores for each party by supporters of that party and those who do not intend to support that party. And of course, for the partisans, for the Conservatives and the NDP, we see that there's a lot of confidence that they're gaining momentum. But also among those who do not support the Conservatives and the NDP, we see that more say that they are gaining momentum than are losing momentum. And again, this stands in stark contrast to the Liberals, where even Liberal supporters, 42% of them feel that the party is losing momentum, and just 26% feel that they are gaining momentum. So potentially disheartening for supporters and volunteers, and something to keep an eye on too, the fact that even those who aren't willing currently to say that they support the NDP or they support the Conservatives feel that those parties are picking up speed. Now, finally, the last section here that we wanted to bring to your attention has to do with voter pools. And I believe we touched on this last week in the webinar. We created a sampling of individuals that shows theoretically the size of potential support that each party could garner. We have our hard supporters, and those are the folks who, for any given party, select them as their first choice and are unlikely to switch their vote. Soft supporters are those who have a first choice party and are somewhat likely or likely to switch their vote. Potential supporters are those who select a given party as their second choice, but would consider switching to vote for their second choice. And then possible supporters for their second choice party are somewhat unlikely to switch. So we then took the data that we collected last week and we compared it to two studies that we conducted prior to the 2019 election in January and October 2019. And the results were somewhat revealing. The Liberal and Conservative voter pools have not shifted dramatically from January 2019 through October to 2019 to today, whereas the NDP voter pool has expanded. First, look at the hard vote for the NDP. We see in January 2019, they're 8% hard vote, then 12% in October 2019, and now 15%. Secondly, their overall voter pool has grown from just about a third to almost half of respondents to our survey saying, that in some way they would be willing to support the NDP. So speaking to that momentum slide, that could be playing into some of the NDP's numbers there as well, and certainly the growth in support for them in Ontario and other regions across the country. Finally, final slide, we did the same thing for second choice support, which I think you discussed last week, just the top line numbers from our poll that we conducted last weekend. But then we took the data from, again, that January 2019 study and October 2019 study to compare. And what we found is that there is something different about the way people are thinking about their second choice vote this election. We see the Conservatives' second choice vote at 6% nationally, and that's fallen over the course of the last 2 years. And we could attribute that to the fact that Liberal voters in our most recent study are quite unwilling to select the Conservatives as their second choice. Just 2% say that the Conservatives would be their second choice, whereas over half feel the NDP would be their second choice. We also wanted to just briefly draw your attention to the Bloc voters down at the bottom of your screen. Last election, 16% were willing, or in the weeks before the election, 16% said their second choice was the Liberals, and now just 1% feel that way. So again, it's a different campaign in terms of second choice support than last time. Something's going on.
Carlene, you have a question for Hillary before we get into the larger discussion?
I know Hillary's going to jump off in a sec. So Hillary, a question for you from our viewers.
Sure.
And feel free, any of the other panelists who want to jump in, please do. Why are perceptions of who is gaining or losing momentum in the polls relevant? Does this impact how people vote?
Well, that's a great question. And to the extent that parties are gaining and losing momentum in the eyes of voters, I want to come back to, first of all, how we asked this question. We asked people if they felt each party was gaining momentum, losing momentum, not really changing, or if they just hadn't been paying close enough attention. And less than 1 in 5 provided the answer that they just hadn't been paying close enough attention to provide a score. So I think that speaks to the amount of attention overall that Canadians are paying to the election currently, and it might be a bit more than we had been anticipating. In terms of gaining momentum, we know that the perception of energy and movement behind your campaign has the potential to perhaps attract some support from those who don't currently intend to vote for you. Conversely, if the campaign is viewed as losing momentum, even among your own supporters, that could be potentially a bit disheartening for volunteers and leaves you open to potentially losing some support as well. And Allan, I don't know if you have any other further insight on that topic.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't always happen. I mean, I've seen elections where nothing changes, but this question often is a precursor to future vote realignment. I mean, I've used the analogy that if an election was held tomorrow, how would you vote is like looking at what's on top of the ice. This question is like what's looking below the water. And as Hillary says, I mean, you can, if your own supporters, as in the Liberal Party, 42% of Liberal supporters right now believe that their party is losing momentum. I mean, that is a demotivator for voting. We also noted last week, 26% of the entire electorate has a second choice who they claim that it's at least somewhat likely they may switch to before now an election date. So the extent of volatilities out there is tremendous. So this is a surrogate for what might happen in the future, with the emphasis on might. That's terrific stuff, Hillary. Really, really insightful, really helpful for people who tuned in, and I think really helpful for the conversation that we're going to have. So thank you very, very much, as always. Bruce, I want to start with you. I mean, we noted that you were the campaign chair in BC for the Liberals in 2015. I remember at the time you telling us that you had never worked with a retail politician that was impressive as Justin Trudeau, that when he entered a room, he lit it right up. I mean, you saw in our poll what's happening with the Liberals' momentum numbers. Leger came out with a poll yesterday that said 41% of all voters' impression of Trudeau had worsened in the last week. Our colleague Eli Alboin looked at that and he said, boy, this started to feel to me like this is a referendum on Justin Trudeau. Is it? And if that's the case, does that spell trouble for the Liberals right now?
Well, thanks, Allan, and nice to see all my colleagues, particularly those from British Columbia. We haven't seen a lot of each other in person recently, but we're looking forward to doing more of that hopefully this fall. I guess, Allan, beauty is in the eye of the partisan beholder. My 35 years in federal politics, 12 campaigns, Justin Trudeau is still an exceptional retail politician by any measure from my perspective, having witnessed them all, but he's not alone in that category. Your friend Brian Mulroney was also a master retail politician, and it gave me kittens in '88, but to watch him work a room and to work a hall and to think on his feet was something, a sight to behold and a good lesson for me as a young man. So there are others in that pantheon, but he is absolutely there. In terms of Leger, I mean, listen, what's the old political axiom? The longer you're in power, the more your enemies accumulate and your friends dissipate. Is that the case? Who knows? I would say, with the deepest of respect to my curmudgeonly friend Ellie, it's too early to tell with just under 3 weeks what the ballot question ultimately is going to be on September the 20th. We've had a Liberal platform landed today, that's focusing on healthcare, housing, childcare, climate, continuing the fight against COVID. Nikki and her work with the United Way would be really happy to see the period equity stuff in the platform. I would also add that's in some other parties' platforms. And of course, a wedge that's in that platform around enhanced protection for abortion rights in this country. So with that and all of the French and English language debates to come, from a sort of overall campaign perspective, this thing is still early days. And it's really too early to say whether this will be a referendum on Justin Trudeau or a referendum linking Aaron O'Toole and some of the anti-mask, anti-vax protesters that have been on the scene for the last 5-6 days.
Carling, I mean, we saw the Conservatives' momentum numbers gained 6 points by our polls over the course of the first 3 weeks. Certainly, Aaron O'Toole has exceeded the expectations, if not the electorate, of the media, and is running a pretty savvy kind of campaign. The one area that seems to be an anomaly of that is your home province. While always competitive, we actually have the Conservatives running behind a little bit the NDP and the Liberals, whereas they won the popular vote last time. If their chances of actually losing some votes in BC is real, where else do they have to pick up in order to form a government, and what do they have to do there?
Well, I'd start by saying it's still a pretty close race in BC.
Sure,
the numbers are, you're right, in terms of the numbers that Hillary showed us a few minutes ago. Conservatives are in third, but I would say it's still a three-way race in BC. And to really, understand what's going on, and we could, have a whole other webinar about it. You have to really look at individual ridings and what ridings are at play to really understand sort of what's going on in British Columbia. But I would say it's still a three-way race, and there's still 3 weeks in the campaign, so we'll see what happens. But in terms of where I think O'Toole needs to and wants to pick up seats is the 905, so Ontario. That's where they need to pick up seats in order to be successful in this election. Other places as well, but definitely there. And he needs to grow his voter base. So he's got his. I mean, I would say conservatives have a very strong base of support that will always vote conservative, perhaps more so than some of the other parties.
Yeah, it's true. We always say their floor is higher and their ceiling is lower.
Exactly. Yes. So he's really trying to expand his support to areas that maybe he wasn't, or the conservatives haven't been as successful in the past. An example of that is women, frankly. Women, particularly suburban women, not necessarily supportive of the conservatives in the past, but this past week, we saw O'Toole make an announcement in Ontario about banning puppy mills. And in my mind, he got a little bit of flack for that from some people. I love that announcement. And everybody on this call knows I'm a huge dog lover, but still, there was a reason for that announcement, right? It was he's trying to expand the base, to grow his, or not expand his base, but grow his support in areas, in other areas. Another one is, unions, for example.
Right. Blue collar workers.
Exactly. Yeah. So I would say Ontario.
I wanted to give you a supplementary on the 905 because we all know how important that region is. I mean, in 2019, Trudeau's enemy was Doug Ford. Mm-hmm. 2021, not much being said. Doug Ford is popular in the 905. What's going on there with that dynamic?
Why is Trudeau not attacking Doug Ford this time around? Well, apparently they came to a bit of a truce on that. I don't think either one of them wants to be dragged into this, I don't think either one wants to be dragged into that debate in this election. So Doug Ford is not interested in being closely connected with the federal conservatives at this point. Although, maybe that will change as the conservatives have started to do much better. But at least at the beginning of the campaign, he wasn't interested in being closely aligned with the federal conservatives. We saw that in Nova Scotia too, right? With the election of the progressive conservatives, they really tried to distance themselves from the federal conservatives. So I think it's beneficial on both ends to not get into that back and forth.
Nikki, when I was doing partisan polling, we used to ask a question, which party would you never vote for? And between 50 and 60% would always cite the NDP. In the voter pool slide that Hillary showed, the NDP has more potential voters than any other political party in Canada. I've never seen that before. And we saw the improvement over the periods of time between 2019. And they are improving. I mean, they look like they're leading in BC. They're making gains in Ontario, especially urban Ontario. But it seems to be incremental. What do they have to do to get a kind of breakthrough like they did in 2011?
I think there is it's less, I think, about what time left is up in the campaign and more about where some of that momentum is showing. I think, some of the messages that are being delivered by the NDP are really clear in terms of talking to people about what services they need and what's been missing. So there's been a really, heavy conversation about, what could be framed around the rich paying their share, which I see it looks like the Liberals have leaned into a little bit this morning in the platform as well. But, how do you look at making sure that government has enough money to fund all the programs people care about? And we're consistently seeing in those polls, people care about education, they care about climate change is topping polls, healthcare. And so how does government make sure that they're actually getting the money to do that? It's looking at how the fair share concept being paid. So I think the more the NDP can communicate, and there is that opportunity because the Liberals are the incumbent to provide that contrast. So when you take a look, and we haven't had time obviously yet this morning to fully crunch the Liberal platform, but just popping over to Twitterverse this morning between sessions, you can see that people are already saying, well, why weren't these policies implemented in the last 6 years of being government? Why was the election called when you could have been moving forward on these things that you're saying you're committed to? And that's a really good question, obviously, that can be posed mostly by the NDP on these more progressive platform planks. And I think, it's important to flip back onto the NDP is only about 6 points behind the Liberals in what Hillary shared earlier. And that's, ranging a lot of the polls too in that zone. So it may come down to a choice for voters when they actually are, now that they're actually able to see Jagmeet Singh, he's got more profile, he's got this momentum, and that perception of a momentum being that important question again, that he is a legitimate choice to elect MPs across the country who are actually going to implement some of the policies that have been committed to that are important to people, and that the Liberals actually, didn't prioritize in the last 6 years of being in government. So I think, that's the job to do, is how do you keep that closing that gap on the Liberals and convincing people that the NDP, or actually I'm not even sure they need to be convinced, if continuing to show people that the NDP is really a viable option in this election.
Well, and just to add to that, we saw 56% of current Liberal voters' second choice is NDP, overwhelming. Jamie, I mean, in the 1980 presidential election, the political lexicon got the phrase October surprise. And this happens in elections. Things come out of nowhere that you aren't anticipated, that throws everything right off. This one, we've got Afghanistan and the pulling out of American and Canadian troops. How is that altering people's kind of sense and the dynamic of this campaign, in your view?
Well, Allan, I think it's feeding into, for those that believe this, the narrative around the management of government and whether or not this has been handled appropriately by the government. This was the most consequential foreign policy initiative that a government made, and it was made in 2001 by the Chrétien government. And since that time, to coin a phrase, Canadians have spent blood and treasure there. 158 soldiers died, and then really sadly another 191 veterans who have taken their own lives since that time. So this mattered, and there were in excess, I believe, close to 40,000 Canadians who were in one way or another involved in this significant foreign policy initiative. It's true that foreign policy does not necessarily weigh into Canadian political discourse to the extent that it does to our neighbors to the south. That said, and again, what it highlights for some is how was this handled, and when people start to believe or not give politicians the benefit of the doubt, then the consequences fall to mismanagement, or the narrative starts to fall to the idea that this has been not managed correctly. So on balance, this has not been a good outcome in terms of the perceptions that some people have. Others may say, you know what, I mean, it was an absolutely untenable position. You couldn't win anyway there, no matter what. But it was a surprise, and I'm certain that it was nothing that the Liberals were anticipating was going to happen as fast as it did.
Yeah.
Put enormous pressure on the government. On balance, we got a lot of people out. Unfortunately, some have been left behind. Whether that sticks to this government or not remains to be seen. But on balance, it's how people perceive how this government handled it, and was it done appropriately and effectively.
Do you think it also sustains that this is an unnecessary election theme that we saw in the early days, in as much as it's allowed some people to say, you should be governing and saving these people, not out, kissing babies and frying hot dogs?
Yes. Yeah, I think it does. And that, to coin a Seinfeldism, an election about nothing. Is this what this actually has turned out to be? And are these issues and other issues? And not only that, Allan, the maintenance, or the idea that this election is taking place during a fourth wave of COVID. Again,
there's the other October surprise.
There's the other October surprise that people are, scratching their heads and going, this doesn't feel right. Not sure why I'm being asked to do this. And time will tell.
Carleen, you've been monitoring the Q&A box there. Anything you want to pose to either any of the individual panelists or the panel as a whole?
Yeah, we've got a few here. One off the top, and both Nikki and Bruce have referenced this, but Bruce, maybe you're best to answer this. What are your thoughts with regard to the Liberal platform released this morning? I don't know, just this morning, so whatever you can say.
Yeah, so listen, obviously in preparation for this event, I haven't had a chance to read the platform in detail, although I think what we should anticipate over the next 12 to 24 hours is some clear indications of the benefits of going last strategically with their platform, which is to make micro adjustments to your commitments that outflank and outmaneuver your primary opponents in the campaign. We'll see how those emerge, and if indeed they do emerge. My thesis is that there will be some things that emerge, but in terms of healthcare being top of mind in the platform, that is an area traditionally where if the ballot question is around healthcare, the Liberals traditionally have done very well. I think from what little I have seen, because we're talking about it almost at the same time as it's being announced, as a partisan, I'm feeling pretty comfortable with it.
I want to bring Nikki in on that one too, because the emphasis, it says, is on healthcare, housing, childcare, and climate. We joked earlier that, it's the NDP platform without a national pharmacare plan. Is this platform a threat to the NDP by virtue of saying you really don't have much to choose here, and we're the natural governing guys, aren't we?
I certainly think that's, a strategy the Liberals have used in the past. I'm not actually sure it's the strategy that's going to work this campaign. And I think that also, while there may be an advantage in some ways to being the last party to release your platform, there's also the case where people can look at and say, well, you've clearly, cherry picked out of the in particular from the NDP platform on planks they've been going out on for weeks at the campaign, right? So I think that can be detrimental in this case, and particularly if we're starting to think about where some of those votes might be coming from. There's a lot of progressives who parked their votes with the Liberals in the last two campaigns because they were looking for action on climate change, or they were electoral reform advocates. And so if those people don't plan to land their votes this time because they didn't see those changes, or I see, I have a lot of folks in my social media feed who are constantly talking about, in terms of whether you believe in buying the pipeline or not, if they lent their vote to the Liberals in the last campaign, and then that was the action that the Liberals took, I don't think they'll actually be doing the same thing this time around. So yes, you can, look at those platforms and see they match up on a lot of the issues, except I think really what we're talking about now, the difference is who's going to take action on them. And it's really hard for the Liberals to put forth this huge document that it looks like it is, and have that credibility on then will they actually enact all of the policies within it, because now the public's saying, 2015, last election with first past the post, here we are again. What's your record on that?
Jamie, we don't really expect much out of the prairies. I mean, we've come to learn not to expect much of the prairies. Basically a conservative bastion with maybe a few seats in the urban centers changing. You expect anything different this time? And in particular, is the People's Party and the Maverick Party have any potential to make any difference in the prairies this time?
On the first part, with these numbers we're seeing out of the NDP, there could be some competitive races in both Saskatoon and Regina. That's not was not predicted the last time. There has been support for the NDP, but if there's an ascendant New Democratic wave here, I wouldn't be surprised to see them maybe pick up some more seats. There is a seat in Northern Saskatchewan that the Liberals are hopeful picking up, with a former New Democratic cabinet minister named Buckley Boulanger and Churchill Mississippi in Northern Saskatchewan. But that's going to be a tight three-way race. As it relates to the People's Party and the Maverick Party, Allan, it's important to remember that in the provincial election last year, the Buffalo Party, which has the same political DNA strain as both the Mavericks and the People's Party, came second in 4 ridings in southern Saskatchewan. So the pilot light is lit. The effect of that, at least with this provincial government, it's had a chilling effect that, while they were focusing almost always on the left with New Democrats, they all of a sudden had this threat on the right that they have to pay attention to, and may explain some of the tentativeness around the province in terms of vaccine mandates, vaccine passports, introducing mask mandates again. The numbers in Alberta, if I'm reading those correctly with the People's Party, may be hovering around 10%, maybe a little less in Saskatchewan, but it's there. And if Erin O'Toole and the Conservatives happen to win this election, if they want to avoid a 1993 scenario again, where the Reform Party emerged not out of nowhere, it had been coming for a while. That was because a policy decision that was made by the Mulroney government, I think it was, Allan, about the F-18 contract, if I'm not mistaken.
In Winnipeg, they moved it out
right.
of Winnipeg.
And that ignited it. So, if the government changes, and I'm not sure about that yet, but if it does, you're going to see I would think a Conservative Party that will be ever mindful of that potential emerging. So yeah, it's here. It's not a prairie fire yet, but it could go.
Carling, I mentioned off the top, we're all Western Canadians, but we ignore Quebec at our peril. I mean, there's many who believe this election is going to be won or lost there. And as is his wont this week, Premier Francois Legault entered the fray and itemized his demands, but editorialized in the same time that both the New Democrats and the Liberals were too centralizing to appeal to Quebec nationalists, unlike the BQ, to no one's surprise, and the Conservatives. We saw Erin O'Toole go in there 2 weeks ago and offer a contract with Quebecers. Is this a big deal for him?
I think it definitely helps. I read somewhere he was very happy when the premier said that. So I think it does to a certain extent, but there's still some issues that I wonder how they're going to land in Quebec, despite the fact that they're sort of more Western Canada. So, example, we heard that O'Toole will revive the Northern Gateway pipeline. He's said that, right? And he's supportive of the Trans Mountain pipeline as well. And we know that Quebec is anti-pipeline. Neither of these pipelines would be in Quebec, but still, I wonder if his strong support for these projects will have an impact in Quebec. But I think definitely the two things or two of the main things that Legault called for. So less control on healthcare dollars. So, the Liberals and the NDP have said they'll transfer money to the province with stipulations. He's asking for no stipulations, and then more control over the family unification immigration program. Both of those things, I think, align well with the Conservative thinking. Legault was happy when O'Toole came out and said he promised to increase health transfers from 3% to 6%. So I think there is some alignment there. I think it is a good thing for O'Toole, but there's some other policies and priorities that O'Toole has that might impact his support there. We'll see.
Bruce, a twist on that question for you. Again, in Hillary's deck, we noted that the Liberals have virtually nothing to pick up from BQ voters. No, only 1% of BQ voters' second choice is Liberals. There's nothing to gain by going after the BQ. By the same token, the Leger poll that I referred to that came out yesterday showed that the BQ vote is far and away the softest in the province. BQ voters are most likely to switch, significantly more likely to switch. In a perverse way, is it actually in the Liberals' advantage to have the Conservatives take votes away from the BQ in the province of Quebec in order to take advantage of some of those vote splits and come up the middle in Francophone areas?
Well, the short answer to your question is possibly. As a British Columbia who hasn't campaigned actively in Quebec for 25 years, I'm always reticent to pronounce myself on a very complex and unique political environment. At the same time, we do know that the Quebec City region, which some of my former colleagues refer to as the Bermuda Triangle of Quebec politics, is a very difficult place to understand what's happening, and that there is this sort of BQ conservative switch voter there. If an election were held today, there would be consequential and meaningful Liberal pickups in the province of Quebec. And so the optimist in me hopes that some of the splits work in favor of further pickups in Quebec. We'll have to see how it all plays out. I would say, as historical context, we have seen in other regions of the country in previous campaigns, including 93, when there was a Reform Progressive Conservative Party split on the prairies that elected a sea of red seats in both Saskatchewan and Manitoba in the 93 campaign. That sort of thing is certainly possible. The other thing that we have seen in the past, both to the benefit of the federal Liberal Party, the federal Conservative Party, and the federal NDP, is that Quebec can do the old herd mentality routine and decide they're going in a particular direction and go that way hard. I should also add, obviously, it happened to the benefit of the Bloc with Mr. Bouchard in 93. So it is very difficult to predict what is happening. I think, the Prime Minister had a very strong performance on the French language one-on-one interview, and we'll see how the debates play out. But once again, as a British Columbian, I can't pretend to have the same depths of insights as we might get next week when our colleague Dan Bernier is on.
Nikki, we touched on the Liberal platform being quite similar to the New Democrats, and they have been very successful. We've noticed in our earlier webinars in 2015, 2019, in coalescing the center left vote by marginalizing the NDP. You ran campaigns. If you're advising Jagmeet Singh right now, would you say, look, what we have to do is we've got to differentiate ourselves on policies? One, you noted, we would never buy a pipeline. We have got a pharmacare plan. Or is it enough for them to simply just say, to attack their record? See, these guys are all talk and no action, which has also been a major part of their narrative. What approach it would be best in terms of blunting that attempt on the part of the Liberal Party to coalesce the center right?
Yeah, I actually think it's a combination of both. And I think, right now at this point, they're doing both. Whether they can continue to do both once we get past Labor Day, I think they might have to probably tighten up and pick one. But being able to contrast right now has been pretty successful. And I think when looking at some of the, policies and legislation the NDP tried to get through, looking at pharmacare, dental care, those things where you can talk to people about, particularly if they've been hard hit through the pandemic. And I think, I think there is an important dynamic that maybe isn't yet being addressed by the campaign, and I don't think it's being addressed by the Liberals, that Jagmeet Singh can speak to, which is how people are hurting. And I think we haven't quite talked yet about what that disproportionate impact has been across the country. People who are on frontline workers who, when you're talking about things like mental health announcements that came yesterday, well, something like pharmacare coming in, being supported across the House would have been helpful, right? When you're actually starting to talk about, yesterday was the Overdose Awareness Day as well. Like, we're talking about some pretty massive issues in the country that the NDP has been trying to get government to address for a considerable amount of time. So I think that's where those issues in particular they are pocketbook issues, but they're issues where people can see what the difference would be in their lives. So I think, it probably will have to pick, but the other thing is there's that level of being able to connect with people. And if we are going back to looking at where Jagmeet Singh's really strong, it's on that approval, it's on the likability, and those are where Justin Trudeau's quite tanking, quite frankly, right, is on people liking him, people trusting him. So I think there's a lot there if this election continues to be about leader likability, which we are seeing a fair bit of play out. If it continues to be that way as we get closer to election day, it's hard to say, but right now it actually is a pretty good question about who do people trust? They clearly like and trust Jagmeet Singh. They clearly think that these are policy issues that he can advance. And at the same time, Justin Trudeau is losing a lot of ground in terms of how the public actually feels about him.
Carling, the other thing Liberals have been very successful at in past elections is introducing wedge issues, where they really are a big difference between the Conservatives and themselves. We saw one of the things in the platform, we haven't looked at it in detail, but they're basically suggesting that they would withhold any funding to anyone who denied access to abortion services at the provincial level, clearly trying to raise the abortion issue again and make it part of the campaign. They've got vaccine mandates, and they tried to tie two-tier healthcare on Aaron O'Toole, and they haven't been able to lay a glove on O'Toole yet. But there are members in the party that they can be tying closer to him on a lot of these things. What does the Conservatives have to do to blunt that, to make sure that they are not tagged once again with a party that's made up of extremists that hold views that are contrary to majority public opinion in Canada?
Yeah. Well, I think, first off, I think it's only going to get worse with the Conservatives ahead in the polls right now. I think we're going to see more and more of that rhetoric, and like this morning, it being in the Liberal platform. But I think that the O'Toole and the Conservatives have to do two things. One is O'Toole needs to be strong and continue to be strong in his responses, strong and firm in his responses, and quick. An issue has popped up, and he's responded quickly and firmly. And for the most part, as you said, Allan, the issues, they maybe stick around for a day and then they're gone. So I think that's one thing. The other thing I'm quite impressed with is so far is party discipline, frankly. Like I really do think that the party is following the leader and listening to the leader. So two instances, have popped up in the last week. One with Cheryl Gallant, and then one with some of the supporters of Kyle Seaback in Bolton. And in both cases, O'Toole came out, said what he said, and both candidates quite quickly put out statements or tweets or whatever, basically supporting the party, shutting it down and supporting the party. And again, very quickly. So I think, I think we're going to continue to see more of this. And provided that they continue, party discipline and the leader responding quickly and firmly, I think they can weather the storm.
Jamie, Carling just mentioned Bolton. I mean, that the Liberals had to cancel an event there, and we're seeing recurring patterns of really quite not violent, but certainly vitriolic protests going on, largely around mask mandates and vaccination, and largely Liberals, although I think that Jagmeet Singh has put up with some of this as well. What do you make of this, and what would you anticipate impact this might have on the campaign, if any?
So, Allan, when you and I were small, young boys in 1968, at the Saint-Jean-Baptiste parade in Montreal, my great recollection from that was the day after that parade was the headline, "Trudeau ducks bottle."
Yeah, standing on a balcony as they were throwing bottles.
Standing on a balcony, and you remember, if you see the footage, a bunch of people come and hover over him, and then he just waves them off, and he sits like this. This is not the only time that we have had this kind of vitriol, as you put it. The comportment of the prime minister then was defiant, and in that campaign, it seems that there was a lot of momentum around the Liberals and him in particular, because he was this new charismatic guy. But what he did then was introduced the image that this was a guy you weren't going to push around. And how does that relate to today? I'm not recommending any political or any politician, put themselves in harm's way, not at all. But what it does say is that people will perceive how you handle these kinds of protests in through the lens with which they'll see them. And in this case, the prime minister has that same sort of strain within him too. And again, you don't want to put him in a place where he could be physically harmed. So the call was correct. But this guy, this prime minister, knows how to fight too. And so I think you'll see, maybe him stepping up a bit, not causing himself any physical harm, but or putting himself in a position where that could happen. But if he was to ever get, God forbid, any politician ever get hurt, I believe that Canadian people they're not on for that. And that could have a serious backlash and could raise levels of support for whomever that attack was directed to.
Bruce, you want to add anything to that?
Just to agree, I think what's important would be to pull back the veil of communicated decency that's emanating from the Conservative campaign and tie a very direct link to the anti-mask, anti-vax protesters and elements of the Conservative movement. This tone and this tenor has been plugged and advanced for years by various websites and meme shops pumping out incendiary information. By linking that directly to Erin O'Toole, it definitely benefits the Liberal campaign. And I think we've seen that in terms of the stability of the race, which is effectively, depending on which polling data you look at, effectively a tie.
Carling, any questions there that are coming from the viewers that you want to put to the panel?
Yeah, I'm just looking through a few. We've got one from our old colleague, Sarah Goldfeder. So I'm going to throw
Stop
that.
it.
We do.
No, don't.
Who invited her?
It'll be too hard. Don't.
No. So here's the question. I've noticed a serious lack of interest in this election as I travel around my community. And part of that I attribute to the incremental differences between the three parties as reflected in their platforms. Is there an existential danger in the relative sameness of the party positions for the system overall? Who wants to tackle that one?
Yeah, that's a big question.
It is a big question.
Is the whole notion of choice and fundamental different choice, kind of central to democracy and the health of democracy? And are we seeing? I mean, you used to always hear this between conservatives and liberals. I mean, Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Not so much anymore, but the differences aren't. For example, we've heard no one really talk about the debt or deficit in this election. Someone's got to care about that, yet it's not part of our political dialogue.
That was what I was going to say. I think sorry, Nikki, I think this election is a bit different and it's unique because we're in the middle of a pandemic. And so it's a bit tricky to be different in current times, or be drastically different, I guess you could say. So while I think that Sarah, you may be right in terms of this election, I don't know that that's a trend that it will continue. I guess that's my view. Anyone
else?
Well, I mean, I've been thinking about this a little bit in terms of the strategic vote question, and if it's something that, the Liberals are going to be able to drive this time. And, one of the challenges, I think, with strategic voting having been a large part of campaigns in the past couple cycles is that it's given people something to vote against, not something to vote for, right? So people aren't necessarily, and I think that is actually a really challenging position in democracy, where people aren't looking at elections in terms of their values and who they want to be supporting and speaking for them. We've created this, you need to do X to ensure that Y doesn't happen dynamic. So I do think that starts to play into it. I think we, sort of need to see this. Might be really interesting if people decide to actually look at some of the issues. I think we saw some of this in BC last year, where it was what sort of pandemic needs do you require, even though we were sort of earlier in, but like what kind of government do you want to protect you and your families during the pandemic? Some of those dynamics may play in, but I do think people are paying a lot more attention than we anticipated. I think we're seeing that in the polling. So it might mean they're paying attention to issues a little bit more as we go through. And climate change is up there in every single poll I'm looking at.
We only have about 5 more minutes, and I want to talk about the debates. They're coming up. The French language one is coming up on the 9th, and the English language one is the 10th. And we've all seen debates they have the potential, probably more than any other scheduled event, to change everything, completely change everything. So I want to know first, Jamie, what will you be looking for as you watch those debates? What is the thing that is going to cause you to go, there it is right there?
3 things, really, Allan. I think I would think that the Prime Minister will start to advance some narrative and language around his record. And I know for some people, well, it's a terrible record. We're the most vaccinated G7 country there. I think that is, I haven't heard much about that. And then I think he pivots to the rhetorical question he will pose to Canadians about, do you honestly think that a Conservative government would have done better, knowing that there are people within that party who are reluctant to advance government intervention on things like passports, vaccine passports. Secondly, I think you're going to see a direct appeal to NDP voters from him to say that you can't, if you don't want a Conservative government, you need to park your vote with us because we're the ones that are government, and we will maintain a social contract that is more to your liking than what you will see with the Conservatives. I said 3, but it's only
That was
2.
3. 2.5.
Okay, 2.5. Thanks.
Bruce,
That's it.
what about you? What, in your view, what does Justin Trudeau have to do on those 2 dates?
Well, listen, I expect him to be faced with withering attacks from O'Toole and Jagmeet Singh. What'll be the wild card will be the Green Party leader, Annamie Paul, to see where she comes in to the discussion and the debate as a key participant. I expect the Prime Minister to do well. I don't want to mismanage expectations, but he is a skilled debater. And I expect him, and he's fluent in both languages in a way that, the other leaders are good in French and English, but I would say he is very good in both French and English. So we'll see how that all plays out. I think compare and contrast is important per Jamie. I also think painting a vision for the future that we want. It'll be, I think, an important moment. I've waited since 1988 for a national debate to have the same impact as the '88 free trade debate between Mr. Turner and Mulroney had. There hasn't been one since then, really. At the provincial level, there was in '91 in BC that allowed the then provincial Liberal Party, that was a Liberal Party at the time, to get off the mat and win 17 seats. But it doesn't happen very often that there is sort of a knockout moment or a pivotal shift. But I do think that it will be the first time that there is a real, genuine paying of attention by engaged citizens in a way that, despite what's been said, hasn't happened yet.
Nikki, if you were prepping Jagmeet Singh for these debates, what advice would you be giving? Would you say, this is what you have to do, Mr. Leader?
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking a lot about the Liberals squeezing the NDP, but let's go flip back on what we said earlier about the Conservative playbook. changing and going after those blue collar voters and union workers and talking to them. So I think in this debate, it's going to be really important in order for those pickups to happen across the country, that Jagmeet Singh's actually talking to those people who may have supported the NDP in the past, but have been leaning conservative. And that, is a dynamic that happens across the country. And the Liberals have been out there on pensions and gig workers and a lot of issues that are generally, NDP and worker territory.
Last word to you, Carly. What's Aaron O'Toole's biggest challenge in these debates?
Well, he's currently the front runner, and that's a very tough place to be. There's still 3 weeks left, so lots of time for things to change again. So he's just got to continue with his strong answers that I spoke about before. Not get drawn into these wedge issues, because I really think what the other leaders are going to try and do. So stay strong and keep going.
Thank you all for joining me. Great conversation, and thank everyone who tuned in. As I say, if we didn't get to your questions, we will try to answer them. Reach out directly to you. We'll also send you a link of this conversation. As you know, this has been part of a series that has been held at this time at noon Wednesday Eastern Standard Time, 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Because of the debates, we're going to move our webinar next week to the Friday, so that we have the benefit of those two events to inform the conversation that we have. So please tune in then, and in the meantime, be safe and be good. Take care.